Welcome back to AutoTechNick. Today I have another great video for you. It's going to be a little bit tech heavy, but I'm going to give you a play-by-play on the steps that I took to get this intake reinstalled into the hull of my 1979 Centurion Jet Boat. Alright guys, just jumping right on into it today. And the first thing that we're going to address that we need to take care of is we need to get this boat level, which in my opinion is one of the most critical parts because everything is based off of that level. I don't know if you guys can see it in the video, but I have these smaller red jack stands under the boat. It's pretty low. I did that so it was easier for me to work on this bilge when I was gel coating it. It helped the water run down and out when I was wet sanding it. Helped me crawl in. The downside is, you can see, not very stable, pretty sketchy. When I did all the stringer work, I had these bigger orange jack stands under it. They're much more stable, and it allows me to get the boat to a nice height where I can actually get underneath the hull and do some measurements and work on it, which we're going to need today. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to swap out these jack stands, the small red ones for the orange ones, get the rear of the boat to a comfortable working height, and then I'm going to move you guys to the front and show you how we're going to get this thing leveled out. Now, it's probably a good practice if you haven't done this. I already have from the previous work on the boat, but you're going to want to make sure that your floor is level side to side. It's also good to know if it's level front to back. I do know that mine is level side to side, so if I set the jack stands in the same place at the same notch, I'm level there, but it is not level front to rear, so I'll have to adjust for that. And really, when it comes to the height on the rear, I just want to go ahead and get this boat to somewhere where it's comfortable to work and it's stable. I got to be crawling around underneath of it. I'll be on a creeper. Just kind of pick what works good for you. There we go, not too bad. So I mentioned earlier, it's good to check the floor if it's level. That's not mandatory, that's just a nice to know, and it kind of gives you a good reference point for getting things set up. You do not need a level surface to do this, but you do need the boat to be level itself. So in my case, I'm fortunate, I'm level across my jack stands, and I say I'm fortunate because these jack stands only have 3/4 of an inch in between each notch on the rungs, so it's a very big, wide range of adjustment. If I needed to make changes to these jack stands left to right to level the boat out, that's where I use these shims, and these are just normal household door shims, and I run them basically right in the V where the jack stand sits here underneath this outer chine, and I'll just compensate with these shims in and out, maybe stack them and just play with it, and that's going to just slightly raise or lower this side of the boat into that cradle of the jack stand, and I can use that to fine tune the level on the boat. Now I know it's going to be tempting to use your level on the top side of the boat to check for level, either across the cap, you can set it across the stringers, the floor, really any level surface you think you have. We're not going to be doing that. Is what truly matters on all of this is the bottom side of the boat, the part of the boat that interfaces with the water. So I'm going to crawl down underneath and I'm going to show you where and how we can measure to make sure this boat is level. All right, here we are, back of the boat. You can see the pump intake here. Now to confirm that the back of the boat is level, I like to go ahead and I just use 2 blocks. Doesn't matter what they are as long as they're the same height. These happen to be 1.5 inch square tubing. And I set those on these lifting strakes on the outside of the keel back here. And these blocks, their only purpose is to get my level off the rounded keel. They're flat onto the lifting strakes, so I'm getting an even measurement, and I can use my level to confirm that the boat is level. And I will pull this measurement in a few places down the keel and make sure that it's good and true. So if I find that this measurement is not level, that's where I'll use the shims on one of the outer rear jack stands to go ahead and make those adjustments so this is level. Once I have this measurement level, we're going to go ahead and jump to the front and show you how I address that. All right, so you can see that the boat is just on the 2 jack stands at the rear and this 1 jack stand up here up front. When I talk about level, everything that we're talking about on this boat is going to be measured from the bottom of the boat. So right up here off the center of the keel, which we're headed downhill quite a bit because we haven't raised the front. Now you can see just now, it looks like there's good height, but you can see I'm on my side and I still don't have any space to work. So we're going to go ahead and get this raised up to match the rear. I do all my adjusting or fine tuning of leveling on the height at the front. I figure it's easier to make one adjustment versus one on each side at the rear. So we'll just start getting this raised up and see how close we are to the level without shims. So we're just gonna do a check here. And it still seems a little low. I'll move back and get it in a couple places, so we're still a little low. Higher we go. There we go. Set that on the jack stand. And check our level. Now I like to use the longest level that I have for this, so use what you can. The downside is it tells you how straight your bottom of your boat is not. Looks like we're still a little low in the front. So let's see if we can get another click out of the jack stand. Pretty good there, without any shims. I'm gonna go all the way to the back and check it just to be sure, but up front, we're pretty good. All right, well, that was quite fortunate and lucky for me. I didn't need to use any shims, so I've found from the past kind of where I put that front jack stand will make small changes to the altitude of the boat, but it's level. I measured all the way down from the front of the keel here, all the way to the back of the boat to the transom, consistent measurements. The boat's stable. I got working space, so we're good. Time to move on to the next step. All right, we got the boat on the 3 jack stands. It's level, left to right, fore and aft. Now there's one more thing we need to do while we're under the boat, and we need to establish the center line of the boat, or mainly the center line of the keel. All right, here we are at the back of the boat again, and you can see that I have it mocked up on how I found the center point of the keel. What I did is I used this tape. I just went ahead and taped this leading edge right on the outside edge of that first lifting strake. I went ahead and taped it up here in this valley so that way I took all the slack out of the tape, and did the same thing all the way over to the other side, and I measured the width from strake to strake on the outside, which this one happens to be 16 inches. So nice easy math, 16 inches divided by 2. Right at the 8-inch mark, I went ahead and marked the center point of essentially in between these 2 strakes and the keel. Now you can see I have this older tape up here. That's when I did the center point of the boat when I was doing the stringers. I did new marks all the way across on this one with this other method. The first time I was using a tape measure and a hand, and it was a little bit tedious and difficult for one person. It would be a lot easier with 2, but using this tape and taping it up there works much, much better. Now, these marks that I have, if you look carefully, I have 3 other marks, so about every 4 feet I have those marks that run all the way up to the front of the boat, and I went as far as I could to where these lifting strakes kind of fade into the bow and I lose that measurement point. Now that we have all of our marks for the center point of the keel positioned in the 4 places, you can see up at the front of the bow, I've already taped some string up on the forwardmost center point that I have marked. I'm going to go ahead and take that string, I'm going to pull it tight all the way down the boat, and I'm actually going to pull it past here to the very back of the boat. I'm going to find something that's stable and heavy that will hold the string back here, and I'm going to move that left to right so that way it lines up with the rearmost center mark that I have marked on the keel. It should line up with the other center marks running down the keel. If not, I'm going to remeasure and find out why. But once I have that placed and it's hitting all the center marks, I can take that string out here and make the center mark on the bottom of the boat, and I also put some tape at the front of the intake opening and get that center point marked there. I'm going to go ahead and get that set up. I'll show you how I have it set up and how the center points are all marked out here in just 1 second. You guys know the drill. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. Be sure to like the videos, give me a comment, even share it with your friends. If you guys have already subscribed, thank you for doing so. Thank you for the comments. Keep them coming. Really appreciate the support, guys. Let's get back to the build. All right, well, I found that fuel jug, the perfect thing to get that string ran. So I'll take you guys all the way up to the front. And I did have a mark that was further ahead for the center point of the boat all the way up here from when I did the stringers. So that's what I used, the base, the tape on the forwardmost part of the boat. So then I ran the tape back, or the string I should say, and you can see this tape actually got messed up when I was getting the boat on the trailer a while back, but it actually hits my 2 marks. You probably can't see them because it's covering them. And then the second set of tape, same thing, we're hitting the marks. And third set, Once again, we're on the marks, and I'll take you guys back to the fourth set. And back here at the last set, once again, it's hitting the marks on both sets of tape. So then, now that I know that that string represents the true center line of the boat, I went ahead and put those marks here on this tape on the front edge of where the intake opening goes and at the rear edge of where the intake opening goes. So now that we've established the center line of the keel of the boat, we got our marks made for the center point of where the intake needs to be. Let's take you guys over here and talk about the intake and what I did to find the center line. Just like finding the center point of the boat, this was a little bit tedious on the intake. You can see that I have a whole lot of tape and a whole lot of marks on here. Now, all my measurements that I tried to make off for the center point, really I was focusing on where the water comes into the intake. So, for example, here on the front edge, I measured from the center point of these strakes or fins, cut that measurement in half, and I found the middle point. And then I also did another measurement from the outside of the casting to the outside of the casting and found the middle point. And I made essentially a bunch of measurements and made sure they all matched up, which they did. So you can see I measured from the outside of this casting up here, total dimension, cut it in half, and had that mark. And I made sure all my marks lined up. Again, measured the total width of the opening here for the loader, cut it in half, got my center point. The shoe, it's the only true square precision machine thing on here, so that was easy to get the center point. Again, back here on the rear edge. Then I made sure that all these center point marks that I made actually lined up with one another. It's one of those things where this casting of this intake is not as precision as what most things are made to today. So you take a bunch of different measurements and they may veer a little bit, so I take a big group of measurements and I make sure that I'm all pretty consistent and line up through them. And that gives me the most confidence that I did find the actual center. And if we flip this over, you can see I did the same thing up here on the top side. Although I did a little differently up here, I went ahead and put some masking tape and referenced these holes. So I had the masking tape square to the intake. I measured the opening, cut it in half, made my mark. I did the same thing up here. Again, these are my main measurements because that's what the water sees. The outside of the casting, not as precise, but again, I still made those measurements just to double check and reference. So you got my center point there, my center point up here. Ran a reference line all the way across all my marks and made sure that they all lined up, which they did. And I even went as far as to make sure all the top side marks match the bottom side marks. Now, one thing that I mentioned on an earlier video where I was putting the shoe and ride plate on this boat, I can't reference any of these machine bolt holes because if you look how much meat I have quite a bit of meat on the outside edge. These ones, not very much at all, which is indicating that all those bolt holes are actually offset to the housing where they're machined. So if I were to measure off all the bolt holes, everything would be a little bit off, shifting to the left side. My intake happens to be a American Turbine or Dominator intake. It's essentially the exact same thing as a Berkeley intake. There's really no difference between the two, and they are interchangeable. Now, most all intakes are going to be a 4-degree intake unless you have something that's pretty exotic with a low profile and a different degree. But for today's video, we're sticking strictly with the 4-degree intake. Now, by 4-degree intake is what I'm referencing. If I were to go ahead and measure this intake right here, you can see that it's essentially leveled out on the surface that mounts to the hull of the boat. The suction mounting surface for the pump, you can see right here it's 3.8, so it's roughly 4 degrees. So there's a 4-degree offset in between the bottom of this intake to where the pump sits. That's really important because a lot of times people get confused between the two numbers when they're asking questions. One guy may answer the question referencing this flange, which will be 0 degrees or level, and another guy might be thinking of the suction mounting flange, which happens to be 4 degrees on this intake. So I really just wanted to mention that because it's very important if we're talking about the mounting flange for the intake to the boat or the suction flange of the intake. So we have the boat leveled side to side, fore and aft. We've established the center line of the boat. We've established the center line of our intake. And we also spoke briefly on the difference of the intake mounting flange to the suction flange, which has a 4-degree difference. Now that we have all that established, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about how we're going to position the intake into the boat relative to the keel. So don't mind my crude drawings, but we have the bow of the boat, the keel, and we're just going to say right here, that is the leading edge of the opening for the pump intake. Ignore the rest of the boat. It makes it a lot easier. We have already set the keel of the boat to level, which happens to also be 0 degrees. So I will use 0 degrees and level interchangeably throughout this video. So we're just going to go ahead and put a 0 mark indicating that the keel of the boat is at 0 degrees. So the next thing that we're going to be looking at when we set the intake is the leading edge of the intake where it meets the keel of the boat. And we want that to be just perfectly level or maybe a 1/16 of an inch higher than the keel of the boat. We do not want that any further down below. So we're going to set that as even with that as we can. Now, one thing that I will mention, that everything I'm talking about in this video, since we've already leveled the boat side to side, we're not going to talk about leveling the intake side to side. I figure that's a given. It will be level side to side to match the boat. Right now, we're only doing a side shot talking about the intake. So we're going to set the height of our intake so that leading edge is equal to the bottom of the boat or just a hair above it. I'll do a crude drawing of an intake here. All right, so we got our crude drawing of the intake. So now that we have the intake set just above the keel of the boat, we're going to take the mounting flange of the intake and also set that at 0 degrees or level. That's why we went through all the work to level the boat out. So now that the boat is leveled, the height of the intake flange is dictated by the front leading edge, which I'll show you once we're in the boat, and then you're going to adjust the rear of the intake to achieve 0 degrees. Now, by doing so, your suction flange is now going to be at 4 degrees installed on the boat. Now, this is why I went through and showed you the difference of degrees on the intake, is because frequently if someone asks a question, what degree do I set my intake at? They don't necessarily specify which flange that they're going to be measuring off of. And a lot of guys will answer. Some will say 4 degrees, some will say 0 degrees. Again, they won't specify on their answer if they're talking about the suction or the mounting surface, which will give them very different answers. It causes a lot of confusion. Boat level, intake level, suction mounting surface, 4 degrees. I'm going to go ahead and grab the intake, start setting the boat, and I'll give you a little bit more detail of what I'm talking about here. So I have the intake set in with 0 hardware. It's just loose in there. One thing I do want to mention that will be different for my boat than most is I built up the area around the intake when I modified it for the shoe and ride plate. You can see really well right here. I built that surface up a lot taller. I did so, A, for aesthetics, but also it's going to minimize the amount of epoxy that I'm going to have to use to set this intake, and ultimately it's going to look a lot cleaner in my eyes. So when we get underneath the boat, you'll notice that my intake won't be sitting as deep as a lot of other people's intakes that you'll find because I did that. Now that's something that I just did by choice, and in the end, it's not going to change where the intake sits in relation to the hull. It just means that I have more fiberglass there and less epoxy, versus if I wouldn't have done those modifications, it would have been a lot of epoxy, especially right in this area. Now let's crawl under and look at the leading edge of the intake. So the view from the bottom side, and we'll take a peek at that leading edge, which is what we are here to talk about. And you can see, get up here, it's just barely hanging down. Before I modified the hull of my boat, this hung down like, I'd say 1/2 inch. And I didn't really like that because, again, it would have required about 1/2 inch of that epoxy on the top side. So that's why I glassed it in to minimize how far this intake hangs down. We're still in good shape though, because like I mentioned, we want this intake to sit a little bit higher. So we need to position the intake up a little bit higher, which is still going to give us plenty of room for epoxy. And also, I can always grind a little bit more off if I need to. We need to get this intake in position so we have the leading edge where it needs to be in relation to the keel. And we're going to achieve that with the jacking screws up on the top side. So your intake should be modified with 4 holes on the mounting flange to the bottom of the boat that are tapped for a 3/8 by 16 bolt. And you can see I got the 2 holes up there that are tapped. I can thread those bolts in. I drilled out the holes to be just a little bit larger on the suction flange, so these bolts can actually drop all the way through and down, so I don't have to reach and I can get to them from the top. And I have jam nuts on there so that way I can lock these bolts down once I finalize their position. These rear ones right now are not screwed in and not touching the hull of the boat yet. We're going to focus on the front two. So all we're going to do is we're going to run these bolts in, and once they contact the hull of the boat, you'll see that they start to actually lift the intake. And I need to run these in to get that intake sitting level with the keel or just a hair above like we discussed. So it's going to take a little bit of me jumping in and out of the boat, making adjustments. Sometimes I can reach through the intake and I can feel and make adjustments from the top side of the boat. So I'm going to go ahead and work on getting just the front two set so the leading edge of the intake is where I want it. And like I mentioned earlier, I will make sure that it is leveled out. Since our boat is level, that top plane of this intake needs to be at 0 degrees, which would equal the same level as the hull of the boat. I'm going to get those set and then I'll bring you back and show you the difference of how the leading edge of the intake sits with the jack screws in versus beforehand. So I finished my adjustments on the leading edge of the intake. Now, yes, the rear jack screws are in, but they're not touching the hull, so the front of the intake is higher than the rear. But right now I'm only worried about the height of the intake in relation to the hull of the boat. So I adjusted both jack screws equally so that way I can keep level on the intake. And you'll notice that it does have about a 1/4 inch gap up top here, so it did raise it up quite a bit. Let's go ahead and drop down on the bottom side and I'll show you what really matters here. So down here on the bottom side, you can see really good view here. The intake is no longer hanging down below the surface of the keel right here, and it has a nice good transition up in. And I'll switch hands here, and using this as a straight edge, if I hold it up there, you can just see how close that leading edge is. It's just barely above the height of the keel, and then it tapers up into the pump. So now with this all set, we need to jump back to the top and start adjusting the rear jack screws. Now to set the rear jack screws, essentially all we're trying to do is we want to maintain the level across the intake, and we want to level it out front to rear. That takes me back when we were at the whiteboard where I talked about the bottom of the boat and the keel needs to be at 0 degrees or level, and the mounting surface of the intake will be at the same plane, which is 0 degrees or level. So we know that it's at a bit of a downhill slope from us only adjusting the front. So we're just going to go ahead and put our gauge on there. We're about 1/2 degree off right now. And just make small adjustments on these rear jack screws here until I get it up to where it wants to be. Keep coming. Pretty close there. It's actually dead nuts on. And what do we have? So we're 1/2 degree off. So I need to keep making adjustments. Obviously with me bringing the rear up, it tilted it a little bit. So I need to go ahead, and it takes a little bit of finesse just working all 4 of these. So I'm going to work on the rear, see if I can get this leveled back out. Then I'll jump back to the front and make sure that front edge is where I want it. Sometimes I found that you just kind of have to work your adjustments around in circles a little bit. Once I have those adjustments where I want it, I'm going to go ahead and run those lock nuts down so those jack screws will be set in place. So I finished my adjustments on the rear bolts to go ahead and lift the rear of the intake up to get it, as you can see, at 0 degrees. I did not need to make any changes to the front bolts. And now we move our gauge. We can see that the suction flange is at the 4 degrees. So back to what we talked about earlier, the bottom of the boat from the underside is level or 0 degrees. The mounting surface of the intake is set on the same plane, level or 0 degrees, which puts our suction flange at 4 degrees on a 4 degree intake. Now I did get a bit ahead of myself because I did not prep the bottom of the boat or the bottom side of the intake yet. So I need to go ahead and hit both of those surfaces with some 36 grit sandpaper. I'll probably just use a little die grinder to do so. So I put some tape down that'll give me a boundary of where I don't want any epoxy, and that will also give me a boundary of where I need the scuff. Because I need to scuff the bottom of the intake, I'm going to spin the jack screws back out so I can get scuffed right around those screws. I'll go ahead and get the intake set back into where we are now after everything's prepped. And then we'll do a final walk around and make sure the intake is sitting exactly where we want to. Make sure it's repeatable if we take it in and out. And then it's time to finally get this thing set in here. So I finished the prep on the intake and the hole. You actually will see once I pop the intake out, I ground the hole down through the gel coat to the raw glass and tapered it to the outside edges where I left the gel coat. On the intake, I ended up taking all of the powder coat off and taking it down to bare metal, simply because the 24 grit was going through it so quick. It just, no reason not to. So I scuffed all of the areas on the intake that will see epoxy. I also masked all the areas on the intake that I don't want to see epoxy. Like on this leading edge, I masked the hole so it doesn't bleed through. But more importantly, on the bottom side, I covered the shoe because it kind of sits recessed up into the hole a little bit, and I don't want that epoxy to get on there because I need that to come in and out. So you can see that I have it set back into the boat. I re-centered it and re-leveled it with all of my jack screws. So you can see that it was showing 0.1, but 0.2, pretty much level side to side. I can confirm I have the same thing up here, 0.3. This thing is really touchy, this digital gauge. It really depends where you set it. I actually found that I'll end up chasing my tail, 0.2. So I know it's level side to side. I can set this on the suction mounting surface and I'm at 3.9 degrees. And on this side, we'll set it up on there, 3.8 degrees. And down on the bottom, on the mounting flange, I am 0 degrees, dead nuts on, and 0 degrees right there. So I know that the intake, just like the boat, is level forward and aft, side to side. And we established the depth of the intake with the leading edge where it matches the keel. So now the intake is finally set exactly where it needs to be and it's ready to be epoxied in. Before I pop it out, the epoxied in, I'm gonna take you guys down, show you where I masked on the bottom side, and show you the final fit of where the intake sits up to the front of the keel. And I don't even think I've shown you guys yet the center marks that I put on the bottom of the hull of the boat and the center marks I put on the intake. I have been lining those up, so those are lined up, and that's what I'm using to center the intake. It is worth noting that on your boat, since it has a shallow V, if you move the intake left to right, that radically changes all these angles. Now, when I did the modifications to the inside of the boat here with anticipation of where this intake sits, I actually spent a lot of time locating the intake, and that's because of the gel coat that I did with the colors and perimeter around the intake. If I would have just loosely set it in there and then done all that gel coat work and then centered the intake, my lines would have been off and it would have looked goofy. So I knew going into this that there was not much room on this intake where it needs to sit in this hole because I've tightened everything up. And I really knew how it was going to sit because I've essentially done this once. I'm doing it now with more precision to really perfect it because it's the last time going in. But on the way this intake opening was on this boat before I started, the hole, it had a lot of space. It probably had 1/2 inch, 3/4 side to side move the intake. It was very, very loose. You could put it in crooked, move it around, shift it all sorts of ways. I've eliminated that. So the lack of movement I have in my intake is probably not going to be what most boats have because I've tightened everything up and just went ahead and already addressed that. So it's one thing to be aware of when you're working on this on your boat. You really need to be sure that when you're setting the depth and level of the intake that it is actually centered. One small shift actually makes a big adjustment. So as I go through this process, I jump around a little bit. I'll make sure it's set, it's leveled in all directions, and I make sure it's still centered. If it's not centered, I recenter it, then I recheck all my level just to be sure that I have everything spot on. Down here on the bottom side, you can see where I've masked around the shoe, and I did a lot of masking up there. I'll show you when the intake's out because all these gaps around will be filled with that epoxy, and I don't want the shoe to get stuck. And talking about the center points, see if it shows up. You can see my marks and bad angle, but they're centered up there. And as well on the front, that mark goes in between those two lines. I did a line on either side of the string, so that's good. And you can see I masked up here because I don't want any epoxy below that on this fin. So I'll just be able to run a nice little bead with my finger once I finally set everything in there. Now to double check the leading edge of the intake, if I can get the camera up there, show you guys, it is just barely above the keel. So that's set right at the height that we need. So we know our leading edge is good, so the depth of the intake is set. So we have our intake where we want it. It's centered to the boat, it's true to the boat, the depth is set, it's leveled, square, plumb. It is exactly where it needs to be, so we need to go ahead and lock in those jam nuts, and it's time to pop it out one last time so we can get that epoxy in there. Now that the intake is out for the last time, I'll give you a good view of the prep. So you can see I was more aggressive on the inside edge, took that all the way down to the fiberglass, and then tapered it out where I just scuffed up the gel coat towards the outside edges. That's why I have that masking tape. It'll give me a boundary to clean up the epoxy, but also told me where not to go ahead and grind and sand. So the boat, it's done. I've gone ahead and wiped it down with acetone. It's ready to go. And then on the intake, this is really what I wanted to show you. I went ahead and got everything where the shoe bolts on. So I actually unbolted the shoe and masked off the pad for the shoe with masking tape, and then masked the shoe with masking tape and bolted it back on. So there's no chance of any epoxy getting in there, but I do want epoxy up to this point all the way around. It's actually going to come up on the sides of the boat to fill that gap a little bit and sit up against the shoe. So all this stuff, just like the boat, scuffed up, wiped down with IPA, and it is ready to go. The time has come. We got our epoxy set out and ready to mix up, and I'm using Seagoing epoxy putty. You can see the part number there, 1350 HDK3. So I bought it in 16-ounce cans. You can see that I used about 3/4 of the cans that I have sitting out here. So this has a 45-minute working time, and I think that should be sufficient for me to get this mixed up. I'm going to try to get a very liberal coat onto the flange of the intake all the way around. I'm more focused on this surface here, not so much on this area here. Whatever squeezes into this crack is fine, but if I have voids there, I can address those later on when I put all the bolts in and do the final touches of this. I want to make sure I don't have any voids on this surface all the way around to the hull of the boat. So I'm going to put it on real thick and liberal here on the intake. Hopefully I'll have enough where I can go ahead and get a good thick layer also on the hull of the boat. And then when we go ahead and drop the intake and set it in, hopefully I'll have enough where I get good squeeze out, and then that squeeze out with all that excess, that's why we have all this extra tape here. And then I can work that squeeze out, make things look pretty, but I don't have to worry about it, get it on these critical surfaces because I have it all taped off. So it's time to get it going. I'm going to set you guys down. I got to start getting this mixed up. I will forewarn you that this stuff is extremely thick and pretty difficult to work. So, I mean, you're not going to be mixing this with a wooden stick or a Bondo squeegee. You're going to be using a steel putty knife. This stuff is pretty robust. So I'm going to get this mixed up onto the intake, and then I'll try to bring you guys with me as I'm getting it set into the boat. All right, I'm about 15 minutes in, so I still got plenty of working time. Got a really good coat on the boat and the intake. I'm confident that I have more than enough, so I'm probably going to be managing a lot of squeeze out. Go ahead and set the intake in. I'm going to probably have to press down pretty hard because this stuff is so thick to really get this intake to seat down on my jack bolts. Once I get it seated where I want, we're going to confirm center, level, both directions. Once I'm happy with the position of the intake, then I'm going to work on the excess of all this epoxy. And it's taken pretty much all my body weight to get this thing pushed down. So now we'll make sure It's centered, and we'll work on our leveling. Zero degrees there. 3.9 on the suction surface. 3.9 on the suction surface. 0 degrees across side to side on the suction surface. It is good. So we're centered up on the bottom. It's showing 0.3, 3.9, 0 degrees. I like it. Now all I need to do is make that epoxy look nice. So I'm just going to take my blade and get the big chunks off, and then I'll use my finger to get this formed how I want. And this is why we put all this tape down. If you don't do the tape, really hard to get this to look nice. And it would have ruined all my work on the gel coat. Mixed up plenty. I'm going to use all this extra that I'm pulling off now to fill some of the voids around the perimeter of the intake from the bottom. But that's secondary once we get this top side looking good. So you can see I had extra everywhere except a little bit right there. See if I can't get that packed in there. And for the rest, we're going to work it in with our finger. The intake is set. I had plenty of working time with that epoxy, so I got the intake set, got all that squish out, pushed out from around the perimeter, and then I worked the edges to get a nice radius with my finger. Once I had it really close to where I wanted it, and once it started to set up, I went ahead and pulled the tape, and then I actually used some acetone on my finger to run along where I had that tape line again to get it really nice and smooth. So you can see we have a really nice epoxy job. And you can see, because I did that extra fiberglass a long time ago, now that you can see I have a consistent epoxy line around the intake, and it's also a very minimal cross section, not overly thick, which is exactly what I was going for. And also you can see now with the gel coat work that I did and all that work beforehand to make sure I had this intake centered, it's looking really sharp, just as I hoped. Now I did throw an angle gauge back on, made sure it's matching the angles in all directions, so the suction housing, or I should say the intake mounting flange to the hull of the boat is at 0 degrees. We got 4 degrees on our suction housing. We're level side to side. I did crawl underneath, and our centering marks are all lined up. It's centered, so the intake is set where it needs to be. I'm gonna go ahead and grab probably a battery, throw it on there tonight just to give it some weight. This needs 24 hours to cure, so I'm gonna let this cure up. It's been a long day. I'm calling it. I'll be back out here later and we'll get this finished up. Now that our epoxy is fully cured, the next big task we gotta do is we have to get all the bolts, all the hardware in, to bolt this intake to the hull. Now, before we do that, I need to take the jack screws out. One thing I did before I put those jack screws in is I put a really light coat of grease around the threads where it protruded out from the bottom. I did so that epoxy didn't want to really adhere to those jack screws, and it's going to ease them coming out. So hopefully it worked like I anticipated, and I should be able to pop them. Oh, there we go. Pop them out and spin them out without really have to fight that epoxy too much. That one's not too bad. There we go. So you can see that just a little bit of grease on those bolts, none of that epoxy stuck to them, so they spun out real nice. So I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of these jack screws out. I need to drill out all of the holes because they filled up with epoxy. You can see they're flush to the surface there. Fortunately for me, my intake is set in the boat in a position where I can reuse the existing holes that were in the hull. I did have to shift it over a little bit from where it originally was, but it's aligned well enough where I don't need to drill new holes in the hull. So I'm just going to go ahead and get that epoxy drilled out of those holes, get them all drilled again. I'm going to get the hardware set in there, and I'll bring you guys back because my OCD is not going to allow me just to jam hardware in there and move on, so I'll show you guys what I have planned. All of the bolts are installed. I installed them dry, so there's no epoxy on the heads on the bottom side, and I also installed each one with 2 washers and 2 nuts. Now I'm fortunate where all the hardware that was installed in here before was stainless steel, so I'm able to reuse it. I noticed this before I took the intake out. All of the bolts stuck very far out of the intake, more than I want, and they actually all have quite a bit of variation on them, and that's because the holes that were drilled into the hull are very inconsistent on depth. So I didn't like that, and I kind of had planned to address that. So here we are. My plan here is to take said air saw, and I'm going to go ahead and cut each of these bolts off on top of the second nut. I've already played around with everything and determined that that's the height that I want. I will be using nylox on here with washers, so they're a little bit taller than just one nut. So I think I have the right combination. I'm going to go ahead and get all those cut off, and then I can pop the bolts out and dress them up. Now the reason why I'm doing this with these in the boat and not cutting the bolts shorter outside of the boat is because of the inconsistencies. I'm cutting a different amount off each one and it would just look different. So I want it so when it's completely installed to look nice, clean, and uniform. So I'm going to go ahead and set you guys down, get all those bolts cut, and then I'm going to have to pop the bolts out of the boat one last time to go ahead and clean up the threads. I got all of the bolts cut the length, and now that they're all cut the length, they're all location specific. So you can see my trick to keeping track of where they go is just a piece of cardboard. I have it marked left, right, and for the front of the pump, and these bolts are acting like how they would be going in from the bottom of the boat. So each bolt is essentially in its proper location in this cardboard, matching what it will be in the boat. Now, once I got them all cut, I took them out and I used a 120 grit pad on my 90-degree die grinder. I addressed the tips of them and a little bit of Scotch-Brite to clean them up. So they're all ready to go. We have the new nylox that we're going to go ahead and install. Got our washers. You can see here that I've pulled out a little bit more of that Seago epoxy putty. I'm going to get that mixed up. And I'm going to go and put a real small layer on the back side of the head where this taper is. Get these bolts installed in the boat, and I'll bring you guys back here in 1 second. That looks so much better. I know for most, the extra time that took, probably not worth it for them. But for me, it's all those small little details that really add up, and it's really what sets it apart. So a little bit of extra work took me maybe an hour to get them in there, cut them down, clean them up, but they're all in. Now I'm going to drop you guys down and we'll take a look underneath, and you can see that I got all the bolts in and I had enough epoxy putty left over that I went ahead and just filled in all these holes. So I used up everything I had, got all those holes filled up and in. Now the last thing that we have to do down here is we need to go ahead and blend in this intake to the hole. We need to fill this big void over here. And also on this port side, you can see there's a big gap running all the way down. There's not one on the other side, and that is because this intake actually wasn't centered in the boat when I pulled it out. I found that when I was doing all this work, so I actually moved it over to center it up, and kind of that's why it's a bias in the opening. So I don't have as much work to do over here. I have quite a bit up here, so I've taped off everywhere where I don't want any potential epoxy putty. I've sanded this down with 80 grit and cleaned it and prepped it, so that way the epoxy putty can blend over onto this and it will adhere nicely. Up here I have tape where I do not want the epoxy putty coming down, so we're going to use the putty knife and work it up into that gap. And also, now that all these screw holes have kind of had time to cure up and firm up, I'll go over those with one more layer because they're all a little bit too low. Add a little bit more epoxy putty on there, and then once all that dries up, I'm going to come back, sand everything down, smooth it out, finish this blend, and that will be it. We'll be all set. We finally got there. I got the epoxy putty all on around the intake, covered all the holes and the gaps, and it's all blended in. Now before we jump down and show you that epoxy putty and that blend on the bottom of the hole, I do want to talk about the tools that I used here real quick. I will say that epoxy putty is extremely thick. It's very sticky. It's very, very, very hard to spread and actually get a nice, good, smooth, even spread. So because of that, that naturally means you're going to have a lot more sanding to do. This stuff is tough to sand. So I started just sanding it with a block sander with 80 grit, and it was working, but progress was slow. So I jumped to the DA and my air file. I did a combination of 80 and 40 grit, and I was able to get the blend all the way around the intake knocked out and blended in probably 30 minutes. So it wasn't too bad. It just helps if you have the right tools. So with that, we'll drop you down and we'll take a look at the blend here. And you can see where I ran it all the way around the perimeter, and it's blended in nice. The screw holes are good, and it's all the way up flush with the side of the fins on the intake. And you can see the blend right here coming off the keel and where it blends in. Now the shape of this intake, the radius on it is not quite exactly the same as the keel, and there's low spots right here on either side when I center or level this deepest part of the intake here to the keel. So there's a little bit more epoxy putty on those sides to blend it in, but you can see it's nice, very good, very thin layer there. And just a little bit of time sanding, you can see it started getting right up close to the gel coat right there. Started getting close to the lip of the intake again, but they're not protruding. Everything's very good. I will say that I put more tape on these fins as I put the epoxy putty on, and I actually put really thick duct tape on there as I was sanding everything down. That way I didn't get into my fresh powder coat on my intake, kept everything clean. And the pocket for the shoe, I ended up taking masking tape and covering the entire shoe in that masking tape, and I actually did wax it also, and then I bolted that on so that way nothing would stick to it and I was able to get it in and out. And you can see that it's a very nice, good, tight fit, and it has just a nice little pocket there. Again, I did all this mock-up without any shims, but I won't have any problems if I drop shims in. It'll just drop that shoe down, no problem. So we're looking good there. Let's see if I can get you guys this other side. Now I might come back and do some spot touch-ups here with some of this epoxy putty, especially up here on the front on both sides. I think I can make that radius a little smoother and make those transitions a little nicer. I do have a few small little low areas that I might want to address. I'm not going to do that now. I think you guys get the gist of what we're going for here on the bottom, how smooth and just a nice radius it is. Up here, it really goes by feel. It really helps that I have auto body experience to get that in, but you just kind of go for a good feel. You want to maintain the shape of the keel coming in and then match that to the shape of the intake. You don't really want to create any new shapes. We're just trying to blend the existing shapes. I'm not going to do any of these touch-ups now. I'm going to come back and do that at a later time. I still have those touch-ups up front where I fix those holes and the gel coat touch-ups, so I kind of need to come back around when I'm all done with the boat for the most part, and I'll hit my touch-ups then. But for now, you guys can see the final finished product of the intake from the bottom side once it's all blended in. All right, there you have it. Getting this intake in the boat really isn't that bad. The hardest part's getting the boat leveled and finding the center of the boat. Any of you at home that have taken a tape measure or any kind of level to your boat and started measuring, you quickly realize that these boats are not true, they're not straight, and they're not symmetrical. So the hardest part about this is actually finding the location that the intake needs to be in, making sure that the boat is level. And through my entire build, my philosophy on that is just to measure, measure, measure. I take a lot of measurements. I try to find different ways to take the same measurement, and is what I'm doing is looking for a big grouping of equal numbers, meaning I'll take a lot of measurements from my center line down the boat, I'll run a string, and I want all those different marks that I did measured in different ways to match up very closely. And that gives me the confidence that I'm looking for personally, to know that I'm as good as I can get to find that center line and establish all these points in the boat. Same thing for finding level. Really, that's the hardest part about all this. Once you have those dimensions established, getting the intake set, it's really not that hard. It's a little bit tedious. Take your time with that epoxy putty, mask everything off, and you can pretty easily achieve a very, very clean result. I know I covered a lot in this video, guys. I really did my best to cover any potential questions. A lot of people reach out and ask about setting intakes. I see that there's a lot of confusion on the internet about setting the intakes, so I really wanted to be sure that I hit all the topics and answered as many questions I could ahead of time, so that way this gives you guys the confidence, the knowledge that you need to get your intake set in your boat at home by yourself. All right, guys, that's another big milestone off the list, and I got just 2 more ahead of me in my eyes. We need to get the engine in the boat and mounted, and we need to get this boat back into the water. So we're getting close. See light at the end of the tunnel, and I feel like I'm on the downhill slope after 2 years of working on this jet boat. As you can see, mock-up block is out. The rail kit's on the bench ready to go. I'm about to get this engine mocked up and jammed in the boat. You guys are going to have to wait to see that on the next video. For now, I just wanted to say thanks for watching. If you guys haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Share it with your friends. Give me your comments. Be sure to like the video. As always, I appreciate the support. See you guys on the next one.